everyone, and welcome to QQI's 10th anniversary conference here in Dublin's historic Croke Park. My name is Della Kilroy and I'm your MC for the next 2 days. Before we get started, I just have a few housekeeping announcements. Firstly, please take note of your nearest marked fire exits here in the Hogan Suite. And a few reminders. Please use your name tag to gain access to the conference programme. You can scan your QR code on the tag to see it. Also, using the same QR code on your name tag, you can gain access to the biographies for all of our speakers here over the next 2 days. Your name tag is also your entry into the venue tomorrow. So if you're not returning tomorrow, please leave your name tag at our registration desk when you leave the venue today. The Wi-Fi here is Croke Park and there's no password. The conference hashtag is hashtag QQI10. And I'll tell you more about the Slido app in a moment, but to post questions, you can use the code number 5991171. And don't worry if you can't remember everything I've said, all this information is printed out and placed on your table for reference. Staff are also wearing yellow lanyards. This national and international conference marks the 10-year anniversary for Quality and Qualifications Ireland. QQI is delighted to see the broad range of stakeholders interested in all matters relating to the qualifications and quality. We have participants here today representing many different collaborations from national and international agencies, professional bodies, academic management, frontline educators and support staff, quality and assurance and qualifications teams, representative organisations, and a range of providers, such as English language providers, further education and training, and the higher education sectors, both public and private. And of course, the reason we're all here, our students. We have a very large audience and we would greatly appreciate your help in keeping the programme running as smoothly as possible over the next 2 days. At the same time, we are delighted to see you network here with your colleagues. Due to a large number of people present, we have organised a system referred to as Slido to capture your questions. Slido is a Q&A platform which makes it more comfortable for an audience to ask questions for their speakers. If we run out of time, we will take your questions away, get the answers, and get back to you at a later stage. So to use Slido, all you have to do is search slido.com and enter the code on the card on your table to ask a question. Don't forget to switch between the different conference sessions so that the moderators can see your questions. We are here to celebrate strategic partnerships and to strengthen those partnerships to effect system change. It is now my pleasure to invite Joanne Harmon, Chair of the QQI board, on stage to officially open the conference. Joanne, over to you.
Good morning and welcome to all of you to the 10th anniversary conference of QQI. May I say firstly how very exciting it is. It's almost 10 years since myself and some colleagues sat at our first QQI board meeting in 2012. So a lot of water under the bridge since then. It's really inspiring to see so many participants here from such a wide range of providers and provision and representative organisations spanning further and higher education and English language education. We often speak of the bird's eye view we get in QQI of post-secondary education landscape, and 10 years on, I think it's truly remarkable to see the kind of positive change and positive developments we've seen in the sector. It's most fitting, I think, that the theme of today is partnership and the effectiveness of strategic partnerships. As we know from recent experience, partnership and collaboration is critical, and I think the pandemic really underlined this for us. It was partnership that enabled our educational provision to be maintained and for quality and the reputation of Irish education to be upheld. This was due to students, to institutions and to agencies working together, and by doing so really protecting that quality and reputation. And of course, these partnerships are not just national, they're also international. and there are a lot of collaborations and liaison going on all the time, and I very much welcome our international guests here today. It is hard to believe that QQI is 10 years old, 10 years since all 4 agencies came together, NQAI, HETAC, FETAC, and IUQB. We brought all the alphabet together for this one, and we came together to create a new entity, and it brings together quality assurance, validation of programs, and the making of awards under one umbrella organisation. And since its establishment, QQI has really continuously built on its progress, I think, in providing that kind of confidence in the quality of our educational provision, both in further and in higher education. In our current strategy, we've sought to add additional value through research and analysis to benefit all stakeholders in their decision making. We have a new focus on the learner and in further protecting our learners through initiatives such as the new International Education Mark coming on stream. We're looking at policy and provision through the lens of the learner, and we're moving to provide greater learner choice through including listed awarding bodies on the national framework of qualifications. We're engaged with current challenges and issues across Europe and beyond with other like-minded agencies. Our international work on academic integrity, for example, will be highlighted later on today with the launch of the Global Academic Integrity Network. The role of a quality assurance and qualifications agency is fundamentally to provide confidence and reassurance in the education offering to learners and all stakeholders. I think as QQI has matured, that complementary relationship between quality assurance and qualifications has had a very positive impact, and that synergy is becoming increasingly apparent to all QQI partners, and in particular for providers and learners. As our current strategy states, the most effective way of working is in a consultative and inclusive manner to achieve the best outcomes for providers and for learners. And I think the effectiveness of this approach has been evidenced in a whole range of ways, but not least through the production of our quality assurance suite of guidelines, the launch of our KINSHA review process for higher education, the revised approach to apprenticeship and the apprenticeship awards, and the establishment of the National Academic Integrity Network, to name a few. And the measure of the success of these projects really is that they have become embedded in practice and they are now sustained and sustainable. As a whole sector, our enterprise and agility was both tested and demonstrated, I think, at the start of the COVID pandemic, when provision went online overnight for many, while at the same time trying to preserve the integrity and validity of awards and managing that delivery effectively. QQI was at the forefront of supporting this change, and although it was immensely challenging, it was achieved with real success, which is reflected in the QQI report on the impact of COVID-19 modifications to teaching, learning and assessment, which clearly evidence this. You'll hear more at this conference around the future opportunities and challenges we all face together, which, while our roles differ, are critical. We'll discuss the digitalisation of our education system and what this could mean for the future. We'll also hear about the key importance of learner engagement with quality and about academic integrity and all of that, and all that it entails. We'll look at internationalisation and the International Education Mark, which will be launched in the new year. And we'll examine the role of the influences that are shaping our strategies as we move and we try to think about what lies ahead of us. What are the priorities that QQI will address in the next 2 years of our strategy? How will the lessons learned from COVID, how will they impact on education in the longer term? What will we retain and what will we build on? And what are the external challenges that we need to address through policy and collaborative action with yourselves? These are the key questions, and my hope is that we get the space over the next few days to explore them further. In QQI, we are always reflecting back while looking forward and scanning horizons, I guess. So for now, I just want to say I'm very looking forward to the session ahead with colleagues this morning as we look out beyond ourselves. I thank you and enjoy the conference.
Thank you, Joanne, and lots to look forward to over the coming 2 days. Next, I'm very happy to introduce Dr. Terry Hartle, Senior. Terry has a most impressive resume and a wealth of experience as the Senior Vice President for Government and Public Affairs at the American Council on Education, and many impressive posts before that. He has come all the way to share his knowledge and understanding of the international challenges facing the education system. Terry leads the higher education community's efforts to engage federal, legislative and executive branch policymakers on issues including student aid, government regulation and tax policy. Over to you, Terry.
Thank you very much for that nice introduction. Thank you very much for inviting me to be here with you. Joanne, thank you for setting the stage for the discussions you're going to be having over the next couple of days. Everywhere across the globe, as the number of people enrolled in higher education increases, policymakers and the public increasingly want to know what are the outcomes, what are the results, what are we getting for our money. And so what you are doing here, I think, is vitally important in a global dialogue that we are engaged in, whether we want to be or not, about the outcomes of a post-secondary education. In talking about American higher education, some of the challenges we face and how they relate to the rest of the world. One of the particular challenges I face is that the size of American higher education is so enormous that it tends to dwarf most other countries around the globe, particularly when we're talking about a country with a small population like Ireland. We're dealing with vast differences in scale. So just about everything I could say about American higher education would be true to some extent somewhere. But I thought I'd start just by giving you some idea of the differences in scale that we're talking about between the US and the UK. Ireland has about 250,000 students enrolled in higher education. The United States has 19 million. There are about 23 colleges and universities in Ireland. The US has about 4,000. In fact, we have about 6,500 if we count non-traditional educational providers like for-profit schools. And as many of you will know, for-profit schools have been an area of great controversy in American higher education in the last few years. Faculty and staff, Ireland, I understand, has about 28,000 faculty and staff. The US has 3.5 million. Another place where we have quite a difference is Ireland has one quality assurance organization. The United States has 114. It's probably a lot easier dealing with one than it is dealing with 114. Again, to put this in context, this is obviously a map of the states. You can see Utah there on the, I guess that's your left. Utah has about 27 schools, the same number as Ireland. You see Little New Hampshire up there in the New England area. They have roughly the same number of students, about 250,000 as you have in Ireland. If you're not familiar with these states, don't let it bother you. I have to say most of my fellow Americans could not identify either state on an unmarked map. So the fact that these are not the best known American states is something that's the case in America as well. But as my colleagues and I at ACE and I talked about my remarks and what I would say, we started by thinking about the major challenges that we're facing in the United States, what policymakers are concerned about, what the media is focused on. And what we discovered is that a lot of the issues that are top of mind to people in higher education in America are showing up in similar or slightly different forms in many countries across the globe. One of the issues we're dealing with in the United States is the affordability of higher education, the high cost of higher education. In America, we very much want the benefits of having world-class higher education to everybody, available to everybody. It's just that nobody particularly wants to pay for it. So what we're looking at in many colleges and universities are high prices. Student debt is an issue of great importance. The president has said he's going to cancel some student debt across the board, as much as $20,000. This will affect tens of millions of people potentially, assuming the courts let it go through. At the same time, we have the high price, the large student debts. Many students, after leaving post-secondary education, find they have relatively low earnings and have difficulty paying back the debt. You know, the debt level itself isn't the problem, it's the debt burden, the problem of paying off the loans that really is a problem for most students. These problems show up across the globe. In the United Kingdom, even though it's a 3-year degree versus a 4-year degree in the United States, students in the UK borrow much more on average than students in the United States. And about 50% of students in the UK, according to the Treasury, will have difficulty or may not pay off their student loans even under the income contingent scheme. In other parts of the world, we're seeing related costs of post-secondary education create enormous problems for students. High cost of housing is an issue. Certainly, it's one that is a very big deal in Ireland. In Germany, we're seeing the high cost of housing as well as increasing energy costs create great problems for students. By some estimates, 60% of German students in higher education are living below the poverty line. In the UK, there's an unprecedented demand for housing provided by the universities as a result of enrollment surging since the end of the pandemic. Some students in Manchester, for example, are actually living in Liverpool more than an hour away by train to get an education. So it's this rising energy costs, the return to school after the pandemic, and the underlying financial dynamics that create affordability problems across the globe. Another issue that so many of us seem to be wrestling with deals with the enrollment of low-income students and non-traditional populations. In the U.S., this is largely a question of race. Enrollment in the United States is highly correlated with income and race. If you are well-to-do and white, you are very likely to go to higher education, overwhelmingly likely. If you are low income and African American or Hispanic, that is absolutely the opposite case. In the U.S., the Supreme Court, in another couple of weeks, will hear a case to decide whether or not colleges and universities can consider race in making admissions decisions for colleges and universities. This is a very emotionally fraught, contentious issue. It has been since it first burst on the scene in the mid-1970s. This is the fifth Supreme Court in the last 50 years, fifth Supreme Court case in the last 50 years to deal with this thorny issue. In the UK, we see extensive reports now of problems with racial harassment on campus, and the UK is very concerned about degree gaps by race. In Canada and Australia, Indigenous populations are severely underrepresented in post-secondary institutions, and generations of efforts to try and redress this have really not made much of a dent in the overall problem. Third issue that we seem to be seeing across the globe are what we in the U.S. call divisive issues. Some people call it academic freedom. Some people call it free speech. In the United States, this has become, in our highly politicized environment, a multifaceted hot-button issue. It involves a variety of things like the alleged lack of conservatives on college faculties, the alleged absence of conservative speakers and attacks on conservative speakers when they do come to campus. It involves charges that students are being coddled, that they're sheltered from things that anger them or upset them, and this, in a result, has the effect of prohibiting and banning conservative ideas from being discussed. It also means in the United States a concern that foreign students are increasingly being monitored by the government. As international tensions involving China and Russia have increased, there are increasing charges that foreign students might be being watched by the U.S. or they might be being watched by their own fellow students, with reports of their actions being sent back to the home country. So this is a huge issue in the United States. We're seeing this in Australia, Canada, and Germany, huge problems with free speech, as well as challenges related to research security, concerns that some of the country's most important scientific and technological research is being shared with people who may not wish the country's well. So we're seeing an effort to deal with that. The UK has legislation in front of Parliament right now that would mandate more free speech protections for students on campus, and at the same time would dramatically increase requirements for the universities to provide more information to the government about research projects funded by foreign citizens, by foreign governments, and foreign corporations. A fourth issue, as I mentioned, accountability and transparency. In the U.S., whether we in higher education like it or not, and we do not like it, quality has become defined pretty much exclusively as post-college earnings. Nobody in higher education would say that that's the only reason you go to college, but to many people, particularly given the high prices, the amount of student debt, the key consideration, if not the sole consideration, is how much money do you earn after you leave school. At the present time, the federal government in the United States has enough data to calculate earnings for every major field of study at every college and university in the country. So if you're a school with 47 different major fields of study, the U.S. Department of Education can calculate 47 different earnings levels for your students. We used to, in the United States, look at graduation rates. We used to look at default rates on student loans. Because of the pandemic, both of those numbers are going to be relatively useless for several years to come. So by default in the U.S., the only thing we have at this point are earnings. We're seeing this again across the globe. Canada, US, UK, Germany, Australia are all reporting more increased efforts to mandate more disclosure. In Slovakia, business groups are criticizing the universities because they say that students aren't being prepared to enter the workforce and that this is going to be a terrible drain on them, and it will prevent Slovakia's economy from growing the way it should. Accountability has a slightly different meaning in Romania. Several members of the Romanian government have been accused of plagiarizing their collegiate work. And so the government of Romania is about to put a 3-year statute of limitations on plagiarism charges to prevent people from having to deal with those things down the road. Obviously, this is a matter of shooting the messenger, but that's where we seem to be going in some countries. But this question about what the outcome is, what's the quality, what's the result, is absolutely critical in every country in the world that we talk to. Let me share with you my takeaways here and things that I hope you'll keep in mind as you go through your discussion. Higher education systems differ enormously across the globe. It's very challenging to sort of compare one system to another system, even accounting for the differences in size and scale. But a lot of the issues that we're dealing with in our own countries are issues that are affecting institutions in other countries as well. And we could probably profit from having discussions with other countries about how we are responding to these issues, how we're addressing them, what options we see for trying to address the legitimate concerns that are being raised. There are, however, relatively few forums for intensive and extensive discussion of these issues. In higher education, we do not have a United Nations for higher education. We don't really have a G20 for higher education that provides a forum for discussion of these things. There are a couple of things. Just recently, the G7 agreed to develop shared principles related to international partnerships and research. The European Union Association, something you are all very, very familiar with, obviously plays an important role focused particularly on the European Union. A strategic dialogue working group was recently created involving the US, Germany, Canada, the UK, Australia, and New Zealand to talk about issues related to research security and international student exchanges. But these are sort of ad hoc. They, with the exception of the European Union, these are sort of ad hoc. We don't really have forums where we sit down and talk about how we're trying to wrestle with these challenges and what we can learn from each other. And I think it would behoove us in the years ahead to think about trying to create mechanisms to share challenges, opportunities, and ideas. And I think that what you're doing here today and tomorrow at this conference is addressing a very critical issue in higher education across the globe. And I'm so glad we have international attendees at this meeting. I just wish there were more of them. And I hope we can have more such forums in the years ahead. Thanks very much for inviting me to join you.
Thank you for those insights, Dr. Terry Hartle, Senior Vice President of the American Council on Education. Just a reminder that you can scan your QR code for the speaker bios and the conference schedule. You'll find the QR code on your lanyard tags. Now for our next speaker. For our local national audience here, Tony Connolly is a well-known household name and needs little introduction as Europe editor for RTE, Ireland's public service broadcaster. Tony has been covering EU and European affairs since 2001. Today, Tony is going to take us through his thoughts on the changing Europe and the impacts on Irish tertiary education. Tony Connolly.
Thank you very much, and really delighted to be given this opportunity to talk here by QQI, so thanks very much to the organisers. I normally get a minute and a half on the 6 o'clock news to cheer everyone up at home, so today I'm getting 15 minutes, so it's like Christmas. I think it's fair to say that we can safely quote or attribute a quote that is attributable to Lenin, that sometimes it feels like decades go past and nothing happens, and then weeks go past and decades happen. And that's really the moment that we're in right now. It's fair to say that the holiday from history that we've been enjoying for the last 30 years has come to an end, and we are living history in a much more acute way than we have done for generations, and I think that's no exaggeration. What we're seeing at the moment is the confluence of old and new patterns of history unfolding. Old in that we are back to almost like a 19th century format of great power, rivalry, territorial ambitions, obviously what Russia is doing in Ukraine, what China would probably like to do in Taiwan. And yet we have very new challenges, nuclear proliferation, global pandemics, biotechnology, and because of those conflicting situations, the old and the new, we are perhaps less equipped to deal with these huge global problems that we face. And this is really going to be the challenge for the coming generations of educated young people from Ireland and across the world. The challenges that we have, the resurgence of great power rivalry, effectively limit the feats of global cooperation. It's harder to cooperate globally when countries are pulling apart in other directions. And it's acutely much harder because the one country that we have relied on to guide the world in its progression, the United States, is going through its own fragmentation and polarization. And it's no longer the example that it once was, and it perhaps can no longer be relied upon the way it was before. Speaking to officials in Brussels who work in NATO, despite the huge surge in troop levels on Europe's eastern front and eastern flank, there is always that fear that at a moment's notice, the United States would prefer to shift its gaze and posture to Asia Pacific. So all of these things are happening at once, and I must say it's an acutely precarious moment that we're in. Also because of the way everything is so interconnected. The people who live around this conference center are intimately affected by decisions made by military planners in Moscow. Everything is linked: climate, energy prices, refugees, migration, inflation, debt, all of these things that we've been trying to deal with in an individual basis over the past 10 or 15 years have somehow all now come together. Even Brexit, which I'll be happy to talk about in a moment, is being pressured and shaped by what's happening in Ukraine. Now, just to talk about where things are at on Ukraine, we know we're, 7 months now into the Russian invasion, and what we can say for sure is that it has been a strategically disastrous decision by Vladimir Putin, probably worse than many of us would have predicted when the warnings were happening back in December and January. Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine using a peacetime army. He wouldn't call it a war, it's a special military operation. And that has really shown the limitations of what he has done. The army was not properly trained, not properly equipped. The strategy was completely wrong and counterproductive. And his early attempt to capture Kiev was a disaster. The Russians were beaten back. He then scaled back his ambitions for the war to try and simply capture the Donbass and then, if you like, hold that in another frozen conflict and then try and extract concessions from the West, perhaps later on. But even that he has failed to do. And as we know from the beginning of September, the Ukrainian forces have carried out an astonishing counteroffensive to recapture up to 6,000 square kilometers of occupied territory around Kharkiv, and they're doing the same now, but with a lot more difficulty in the south around Kherson. How is Russia responding to this? Well, we've seen the response in recent days. Perhaps the main trigger was the attack on the Kerch Bridge linking Russia with Crimea the weekend before last, and the retaliation has been unspeakably vindictive and cold-hearted by the regime in Moscow. They have simply unleashed scores, if not hundreds, of missiles and rockets and now Iranian drones on civilian infrastructure and residential areas as well. This is both vindictive and also an attempt to break the spirit of the Ukrainian people. But we know for pretty much certain that that is not going to work. The invasion of Ukraine has emboldened the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian people to a degree that nobody could perhaps have anticipated. It has galvanized and strengthened Ukraine's identity, its national spirit, and with every death in Ukraine, that spirit seems to be strengthened. So what we're left with is a scenario where Vladimir Putin has cornered himself and cornered the Russian government, and his only strategic toolbox at the moment appears to be escalation. Now that can be quite terrifying for people because it has let the genie of a nuclear response out of the bottle, and it's very hard to put that back in, certainly in terms of the rhetoric that we're seeing at the moment. It's hard to see how this is going to end, but it seems that it can't end in a military victory by Russia. It's been said many times that for Russia to win, there may be peace, but for Ukraine to surrender, there may be no more Ukraine. And I think everyone knows that that is the dynamic and the driving force behind Ukraine's resistance. The recent counteroffensive as well has removed the argument from the Western discourse that Ukraine should perhaps sue for peace, settle for some kind of compromise that can let both sides claim victory and end the terrible energy crisis that we're in and start to bring the world back from the brink. But I think the fact that Ukraine has done so well in terms of its territorial achievements means that that option is simply not on the table. And of course, at this stage, no one really trusts the Russian government to be a good faith partner in any settlement. We can be reminded, if you like, of what happened in Vietnam 40, 50 years ago. The strategy of the Johnson administration was to bomb the North Vietnamese into submission, and it didn't work. And then you had this bizarre blend of heavy bombing with lavish inducements to the North Vietnamese to come to the table and find some kind of negotiated solution. Something similar to that is happening at the moment. The nuclear saber rattling that the Kremlin is engaged in, combined with a very heavy, a much heavier strategic bombing effort across Ukraine to hit civilian targets, to try and grind Ukrainian morale and Western morale down, combined with the threat, of course, that we're all familiar with of energy crisis, huge energy bills coming into the winter, the hope that populist politics in Europe will force a change of heart in European sanction decision-making. But we know that that hasn't worked so far, and the evidence is there that it's not really going to work in the coming months. All of this has forced Europe to make huge changes to policy, changes that normally take months, if not years, to enact in terms of sanctions against Russia, in terms of completely re-engineering the energy market in a way that would have been unthinkable some months ago. It's also changed the way Europe thinks about enlargement. We are now seeing a huge number of countries being ushered in to the waiting room, if you like. Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova are all being given perspectives on membership. Bosnia and Herzegovina last week just got its candidate status. So it has forced Europe to think in much more dramatic and radical ways than it has been accustomed to in the past. So closer to home, of course, we have the Brexit negotiations. Just to recap, when the referendum happened in 2016, nobody anticipated that Ireland would be at the centre of the withdrawal treaty discussions, and no one would have anticipated that the issue of the Irish border would still be with us 6 years later. Where we are at the moment is that the negotiations on trying to ease the burden of the Northern Ireland Protocol have resumed after being in suspension since the 11th of February. We are looking at ways to make customs and agri-food checks a lot less onerous, and to deal with other much more technical and difficult issues around VAT, competition rules, governance, or what we refer to when we talk about the role of the European Court of Justice. Now, all of this has been contingent on a stable and reliable situation in UK politics. And we can safely say that just hasn't been happening at the moment. Over the past 6 years, I suppose the contradictions of Brexit and the inability of the Conservative Party in particular to really get to grips with what Brexit would mean, what it could potentially mean, and what it doesn't mean, has pushed the party into ever deeper spasms of conflict and fantasy. And again, we're seeing this being played out today. We had David Cameron's resignation, Theresa May's resignation, Boris Johnson has gone, and now Liz Truss is hanging by a thread. And all of these paroxysms of political chaos can be traced back to the decision to leave the European Union. It's hard to say how much energy and political capital the EU will invest now in these talks process if they think that Liz Truss is going to be gone within a week or two. But I think the sobriety which seems to have taken hold of the Conservative Party in the last number of days would suggest that the new government is less inclined to push for a hardline enactment of the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill as a way to extract very radical concessions from the European Union. The big, I suppose, unknown of all this is what's going to happen with the Northern Ireland institutions. Will the DUP find a way to make some kind of staged return to Stormont if they see that some of their concerns are being addressed in the talks? We'll have to see how that all pans out. One of the many weird consequences of Brexit was that there were some 60 British officials in the European institutions who suddenly discovered that they could get Irish passports, and they were given Irish passports, and that meant that they could then be considered Irish citizens within the EU institutions and could be upwardly mobile. What happened with Brexit is they weren't going to fire British officials working in the institutions, but they were going to be limited as to their upward mobility. So 60 of them got Irish passports and are now considered Irish citizens and can therefore move up the ranks. And this has shone an uncomfortable light on the problem of not enough Irish graduates getting jobs in EU institutions. According to the way the divvy up of staff at EU level is organised, it's on a proportional basis depending on the number of, or the population size. And according to that key, there should be around 70 Irish people entering the EU institutions every year at entry level, and it's only around 28 or 30. Now, a lot of the problem there is because we suffer in Ireland from language skills, because of the big tech temptations. A lot of young graduates will get work in the Googles or the Facebooks or whatever in Dublin, and are less inclined to go to Brussels, where if you want to move up the ranks in the institutions, you have to do the concours. It's a very challenging examination. It takes about 14 months to do it. And as a result, we're not getting people into the institutions the way we should, according to our population size. And this is causing a problem for the government, because there is something like 30% of Irish staff in the institutions are due to retire in the next 5 or 6 years. They're over 58. And that's going to cause a bit of a demographic cliff edge for Irish representation in EU institutions. And that's going to be a problem. It's very important for every member state to have their own people working in the institutions. Now, the Irish government have been going to great lengths to try and encourage more people to get more language skills, to get into the institutions. There's a much broader secondment program now from the civil service into the institutions as well. But it is a challenge. One interesting fact as well is that because there are no new British people entering the interpretation and translation service in Brussels, Irish interpreters and translators are being lobbied heavily by the institutions to go and work in Brussels because they are native English speakers. So again, it's a challenge to get those people to develop the skills that they have. I mean, from my own personal experience, I have 2 kids, 3 and 6. They go to a Montessori school around the corner, and there are now about 6 Irish kids in there. One parent couple that we know, a guy whose parents worked in the institutions, they're Irish. He's now got kids. They're in the school. Another couple, a woman whose wife has come over to be an Irish language translator in the institutions, and their kids are now at the school. This possibly constitutes a gang for my kids to join, which is great news. But it is an indication of the changing complexion of Irish people coming to work in Brussels. What I can just conclude by saying is that I think the people who are graduating at this moment are entering a world which is changing rapidly and is probably more precarious and uncertain than at any time since the Second World War, simply because of the power dynamics that are at work at large in the world, and they're acutely being felt in Europe. William McCaskill, who's the Oxford University philosopher, points out that if human beings survive as long as the average mammal species, then for every person alive today, there'll be 1,000 people alive in the future. So on the scale of a typical human life, humanity today is barely an infant struggling to walk. The average mammal species lasts 1 million years, so we have 700,000 years ahead of us if all goes well. So let's take those steps, and I wish all the graduates coming forth in the coming months and years the best of luck, because they'll need it. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much for those really interesting perspectives, Tony Connolly, RTE's Europe editor. We're now going to hear from Dr. Linda Doyle. Linda's going to provide us with her perspective on quality and qualification systems as a senior leader, provost and president of Trinity College Dublin. Dr. Linda Doyle.
Thank you. Can I say thank you to QQI for asking me to speak, and to say congratulations on 10 years. It was actually great to hear Terry and the international perspectives, and to get to listen to Tony for longer than 1.5 minutes. And I think I'm going to be kind of picking up some of the themes of that again. I actually renamed my talk Quality in the Face of Adversity, which kind of, I think, takes up from the previous 2 speakers. So I suppose everywhere I go, I suppose I always start with the story of the funding of third level, and I'm actually going to talk about that a little bit now. So one of the things, I think, one of the ways we can kind of gauge how well Ireland is doing is through one report that I often turn to, and that's the EUA Public Funding Observatory annual reports. And the way I describe that to people, I say there's a good graph and there's a bad graph. And when you stand back and look at it, Ireland always lands on the bad graph. So our system, our third level system, lands on the bad graph. So what I have on the next slide is a picture of that bad graph. Some of you will be really, really familiar with this, but just to maybe give you a little bit of context. So the orange lines are the number of students, and the grey lines is the funding. And on the bad graph, all of the countries who make the bad graph have a decrease in funding. And Ireland is, this looks over the past 5 years, Ireland lands on that bad graph. But not alone are we on the bad graph, we're the baddest on the bad graph. And if you look at it, We have consistent year-on-year decrease in funding and increase in student numbers. So as you see, other countries that have a decrease in funding, in some cases, they also have fewer students going into the sector. But in Ireland, we have the worst of both worlds. We have more and more people coming in and less money per student. So for me, that is a huge part of the system that we have to operate in. And when we ask ourselves anything about quality or about how all of us behave, what all of us can achieve, whether we're talking about universities, technical universities, or other institutes of education, I think we need to hugely bear that in mind. Now, I think both Tony and Terry have done a very good job of setting the wider context. And part of what I've been saying recently, if it were just funding alone, that would be one thing. I think we could get on with it. But we are seeing ourselves in a kind of very, very different environment. And to a certain extent, I'm reinforcing some of the comments that were made earlier. But we obviously are still, I think, feeling the effects of COVID. For me, when I look at my own institution, I don't think we've fully got to grips with the kind of hybrid working, the mixtures of things we've had to experience. As everyone will know here, there's been 2 years in a row now when the Leaving Cert results have been really delayed. For most institutions, including our own, we've had 2 different starts to term, which has caused a whole load of, further disruption for our students. We have the challenge of hybrid working. We've new legislation in the system that's affecting many of our institutions. We've had the Ukraine war. In our own case, we are actually the only university with the Russian department, and we also had the challenge of getting our students out of Russia. We've had huge demand on student services. So we're seeing, 1,000 more students this year in need of, for example, counselling services than in the previous year. We've had disruption of supply chains. I've used this graph before and I've said the balloon is unfortunately not something fun and happy. It actually represents just one thing in the supply chain. For example, our researchers can't get access to helium. But it's a tiny thing, and it's just symbolic of all of the supply chain issues we're all facing. We have the issues around energy, and I think we have to be honest. Some of those issues are due to the international situation that Tony spoke about, and some of those are due to our own country being fit for purpose, because even before the Ukraine war happened, we were facing into situations where the grid in Ireland couldn't cope with all the demand on it. And then, of course, we have things like the housing crisis, which Terry spoke about throughout this. And underneath all of this is the rising inflation. That means everything all of us are doing, we're getting less and less value for it. So it's a very, very, very challenging situation we find ourselves in at the moment. And it echoes very much, I think, with the international situation, what both Terry and Tony spoke about. I included this picture. So this was the picture. Actually, this picture was taken by a colleague of Tony's, Emma O'Kelly, the RTE education correspondent. I just took this from her Twitter feed. So these were the students actually in Trinity last week at the protest. And it's the biggest number of students I've seen at a protest in many years. And we know that this happened around the country in different educational institutes. And I think this says a huge amount. This is a real recognition by students of saying, we want something better. And when I look at that, I mean, I haven't even spoken about the planet, but oftentimes what I think about is I wonder, are we robbing our students of their future at the moment? So not alone is the planet burning on one hand. On the other hand, we're making it so difficult for people to engage in education because structurally in this country, it's hard to find somewhere to live, it's hard to afford, it's hard for any student, no matter what the education level they're looking for, to fully engage in that and not be distracted with the other pressures of life. So that's the context, I think, that we really find ourselves in the moment. So I've been thinking about this a lot, and one of the things I believe in is when you're in times of difficulty, it's a good time to think, how can we do things differently? So I would say, despite all that, however, we can look forward and we can think about things in a different way. And for me at the moment, there are two kind of key ways of thinking that I'm personally finding very helpful. Some of you may have heard me talk about a few of these before, so I just want to introduce those as a way that I think really matter in terms of running any institution, but also in terms of thinking about quality. And in fact, actually, one of the questions that I saw came up about quality. Quality is much more than earnings. It's about the extent to which education is equipped to build healthy communications in society. I saw a comment come up in Slido. I hope that that comment will actually kind of come to the fore when you see what I have to say. So the first of the two things that I find really important is this book that I found hugely inspirational. It's called The Good University. And for those people not from universities, you can just take that as the good institution. But The Good University is a book that has really, really inspired me. So it's a book that looks at the reality of running a university and the understanding that if we want to thrive, that the universities or the institution has to fire on all cylinders by bringing talents of all staff and students together. It's a university that's inclusive, a university that's democratic, engaged, truthful, creative, and sustainable, as it says in that book. And what the book does, it unpacks this in different ways, and it kind of challenges us to think more radically about what good really means and how we actually have, I suppose, a fabric, I suppose, a strong fabric in the university on which we can build. And I suppose another way of putting it, I think very often, and maybe this is an oversimplified way of putting it, very often we in universities do research about how other institutions and society should behave to be better. And it's about forcing us to walk the walk as well as talk the talk. That's to me what the Good University is about. So in looking at this book and in kind of understanding the factors that were in a good university, I've been asking myself a lot, how do you put this into action? And this is where I'm going to bring in the second point. And in both these cases, I'm borrowing from great work that other people have done. So the second thing that very much motivates me is this notion of the donut economics that Keith Rayworth would have brought in now a good few years ago. So I'll just explain this a little bit, and then I'll map it back to the institution. But Keith Rayworth kind of looked at the world around her and said, okay, we are all working in a very particular way where our lives are dominated by growth and GDP and one kind of fixed way of looking at the world. And said to herself, okay, there's a different way that we need to think about the world and think about economics. So rather than think of a GDP curve that's going up like this, she introduced the notion of a donut. And to me, there were two key things in it. There's this notion of the ecological ceiling, so that if we actually want to really kind of work and thrive, we need to not go beyond an ecological ceiling. And there's the notion of a social foundation, the kind of fabric that society should be built on. And if you look at there, the social foundation, I hope you can see it, range from things to do with gender equality, social equality, political voice, things to do with access to energy, water, food and health, access to education, having a good income and having housing. And the way she talks about it, that the safe and just space for humanity is between these two bounds. So if you undershoot, if there's a shortfall in the social foundation, society doesn't thrive. If you overshoot, society doesn't. If you go above the ecological ceiling, society doesn't thrive. And what I've just, so lots of economists have different views on this, but I've also just referenced another report at the bottom called the Dasgupta Review, which is a much more kind of, I suppose, technical review, but actually speaks about very, very similar things in different ways, in different mathematical ways. So if people want to go a different route and look for, I suppose, some kind of alternative thinking that thinks about the social condition the world is in and the ecological condition the world is in and how we thrive. So what I've been looking at is how you downscale this to the level of the institution. And if you look at the work that Keith Rayworth has done, she talks about forcing us to think locally and globally. So how do we do things locally that allow our own staff and students to thrive? How we allow our own ecosystem to thrive? And how do we do things locally so that globally we don't negatively impact people as well? And for me, we need to look at universities and institutions and quality increasingly from this perspective. So what I've just done on the last few slides is I've redrawn Kate's donut, And at the centre, I've put some new words that relate to the institutions. They're taken from hers. And I'm saying that a good university would operate in that space between the social foundation and the ecological ceiling. And the kind of things that are at the centre are the things like equality, diversity, respect, and democracy. There are things like fairness. There are things like giving people time, the right time. And for me, that's about radically rethinking bureaucracy and everything you need to do with it, about freeing up things, about giving people space to work, the energy, the staffing. And when I look at those things in the social foundation, some of those things are completely within our gift to bring, and some of those things are things that we actually obviously need extra resources for. Likewise, the ecological ceiling, I've just left the wording that she's used, are the things that we don't need to go beyond. So all I've done here now is just given some simple examples. I mean, in terms of not going beyond the ecological ceiling, there's incredible work that's happening in, for example, having green labs. If you look at things like food clouds and food wastage, in my own university, we have a big focus on biodiversity. There's all sorts of research projects, like, for example, I just happen to have one connecting nature there. There's the work that we're all doing on our own emissions. So there's things that we're doing at the ecological level, more and more of which we need to do, that will help us kind of remain with that ecological ceiling, though we have much more to do. And likewise, there's lots of interesting things happening at the social foundation. So some of those are things that I think we've great control over. You can create the fabric in your own institution that makes sure people are nurtured, that they have a voice. You can radically reduce the amount of bureaucracy, simplify things to give people time. We have, for example, a Scholars at Risk network that lots of people here are involved in. That's something we do locally that also has that global effect where we can nurture people from countries at risk. But there are also things we can do, for example, and I think actually this really relates to some of the things that Tony was talking about. I'm a big believer in open scholarship and open science. I find it very, very challenging that the world, this notion of even research security, where we as educators are being asked to kind of confine our knowledge lest some third party nefariously use it. I feel that it's incumbent on us to push back and to keep the educational world an open world. So there's things that we can do locally as well about open science and open scholarship that have that global reach. And then there's things we really, really struggle with, like fair stipends for students doing research, like adequate housing, like energy supply, and all of those are part of the social foundation that we need to work on as well. So I suppose my point is yet again here, that social foundation, we as institutions, including QQI, have choice over some of it. And we as institutions need to work together to make sure adequate resources are put into the others. And if we don't, if there's the shortfall or overshoot, I don't think we operate as good institutions or in safe spaces. So I suppose to come to a conclusion, I just want to focus on briefly on Trinity. For me, when I talk about this, I say I want Trinity to be a good university. I want Trinity to be a place where that social foundation is there, and I want us to stay underneath that ecological ceiling. I would fully admit we have lots to do. I have a few examples of some of the good things that we're doing. You're going to meet later today our Vice President for Biodiversity and Climate Action. It's the first time Jane Stout is in the role. It's the first time we've had such a role. And that's making us really rethink everything we do in the context of that ecological ceiling. Some examples of that kind of social fabric is an inclusive curriculum. That's not just about access for people with disabilities. It's about understanding that we're very locked in Western world thinking and taking that wider perspective on the curriculum and standing up to those kind of issues that Tony, I think, brought up. We have a Trinity Sanctuary Fund for people coming from countries that are in distress. And we're also rethinking building and moving away from new build to refurbish and regeneration, just as some of the examples. And there are plenty of institutions that I could name do wonderful and amazing things, I think, that lead to that kind of stronger social foundation and ecological ceiling. But ultimately, and I suppose this is my main message, for any of our institutions to be good, the system needs to be good. And I think what we're here today, if you look at one of the main words, and Johanna pointed it out, is the word partnership. And we're in partnership here to drive the system to be better. And I think there is an enormous amount more for us to demand and direct and guide in terms of creating a good system. And for me, a good system is one that embraces all those issues where people are treated fairly, where we fight against precarious labour, where students are able to do the learning that they're supposed to do, where we recognise that there's many different forms of learning and people can engage in different ways, where we're funded appropriately, where we cut out unnecessary bureaucracy and we make things as simple and as easy to engage with, where we share the kind of things that Terry was talking about with each other, and where we work together to really create the good system so each of our institutions can be good institutions within that system. So I'm going to wrap up there and say thank you very much for listening, and that greatness is built on goodness.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Linda Doyle, President of Trinity College Dublin. Now, before we move on to the main big topics we're covering today, we have Dr. Pádraig Walsh. As CEO of QQI, he's steered and directed QQI over the last 10 years. Pádraig would like to reflect on some of the system achievements and some new initiatives in quality and qualifications, and how working in tandem and partnership with many organisations here today is a critical success factor for the future. Dr. Pádraig Walsh.
Thanks very much. Conscious that I'm standing between you and your coffee, so I'll get through this as quickly as I can. It's a great pleasure to welcome everybody to QQI's first in-person event since February 2020, which actually was held here as well. And it's wonderful to see so many colleagues here, but we're only sorry that the registration for the event had to close early as registration reached the conference centre capacity here by mid-September. I think this not only shows the demand for people to get back to in-person events, but is also testimony to the wonderful array of speakers, to our poster presenters, and to the quality of the programme that Karina Maguire and her colleagues in the Partnership Division in QQI have put together for the event. As the QQI chair outlined earlier, this year is a very special one for QQI, where we celebrate our 10th anniversary on the 6th of November next. That date also, however, will coincide with the end of term for a number of our board members. I'd particularly like to thank the QQI Chair, Joanne Harman, our international member, Dr. Barbara Brittingham, and members Mary Danaher, Thomas McDermott, Dr. Anne Walsh, and Dr. Niamh O'Reilly for all the work on behalf of QQI over the past 5 to 10 years. As you've seen, the theme for the conference is strengthening strategic partnerships to effect system change. That theme comes directly from QQI's Statement of Strategy 22-24, where we've identified 4 key priorities that will guide us over that 3-year period. Over the course of that strategy, our 4 priorities are in the areas of information, protection, development, and insight. To advance those priorities, we're relying on 2 key enablers: to strengthen strategic partnerships to effect system change, and also to build organisational excellence. Well, one of my colleagues from DCU previously asked me what I hope to get out of this event. One of the things that I said is that we have a huge range of stakeholders, and QQI can only do so much. In many cases, all we can do is rent the hall. But I think the advantage is we can bring together an extremely wide range of stakeholders. So today, having gone through the attendance list, we have representatives from public and private higher education institutions, from our education and training boards, from community and voluntary sector providers, private further education and training organisations, awarding bodies, international quality assurance and qualifications bodies, student, higher education and industry representative bodies, advocacy bodies, our government department and state agencies. In addition, with the new functions bestowed upon us in the Qualifications and Quality Assurance Act 2019, we are also now working with the English language education sector on a statutory basis for the first time, and many of them are represented here also. We also work very closely with other state agencies, particularly with our colleagues in the Further Education and Training Authority, SOLAS, and the Higher Education Authority. When the new Department of Further and Higher Education, Research, Innovation and Science, a mouthful, was established in 2020 by the current government, QQI uniquely had points of intersection with the further education, higher education and research and innovation divisions of that department. We therefore feel well placed to contribute to the government's ambition to progress the development of a more unified tertiary education system. In the decades since QQI's establishment, there have been huge changes in the education and training landscape. We have seen, for instance, the establishment of 5 new technological universities formed from 13 former institutes of technology. 6 of our publicly funded universities are now led by female presidents, 50%, the highest in the European Union, where only 3 years ago that figure was 0. You have, of course, already heard from Linda Doyle from our oldest university, Trinity College, this morning, and tomorrow you'll hear from Orla Flynn, president of one of our newest universities, Atlantic Technological University. Since 2013, in the further education and training space, 33 vocational education committees and FOSS have been transformed into 16 regional education and training boards. But in addition to such structural changes, we've seen the seismic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on education and training in 2020 to 22. That disruption allowed our educational institutions a chance to demonstrate that they were capable of pivoting overnight to remote teaching and learning and to ensure that students were still able to complete their programmes of study on time. What QQI particularly learned from that event was the crucial importance of partnership. Led by the government department, a cross-sectoral steering group of provider and student representative bodies, agencies and other service providers worked closely together over 2020 and 21, meeting mostly on a weekly basis, to oversee the issues that COVID-19 was posing and identified and solved many of the challenges posed. In August of 2020, QQI produced and published a 180-page analysis of the impacts of COVID-19 in Ireland on education, within Ireland and globally. Key to that timely publication were the input, however, from our partners, particularly from the further and higher education providers and from the student representative bodies. This clearly formed our thinking when we were developing our new strategy last year and led us to identify the key enabler of strengthening strategic partnerships to effect system change. That ultimately led to the theme for this year's anniversary conference. QQI stakeholders are well aware of our role as a quality assurance body through our collaborations in particular with the European Association for Quality Assurance in Higher Education, ENQA, and our partner agencies such as QAA in the UK and TEXA in Australia, all of whom are participating in our conference this week. And I'd like to take this opportunity to wish our colleagues in QAA in the UK a special 25th birthday wishes. It takes a lot for Quangos to get to 10 years, 25 years is certainly an achievement. Over the past 2 years, QQI has completed the inaugural quality review of all 16 education and training boards. The reports of the last 3 ETBs will issue next month, and we've committed to the publication of a sectoral report that will highlight the key themes that have arisen from these reviews. I'm delighted that the joint chairs of that sectoral review team, David Jones and Frigga Hengeveld, will be presenting their experience of the reviews later this morning. QQI is also coming to the latter stages of the current Kintra review cycle for our higher education institutions, and that cycle has included the first quality reviews of the newly established technological universities with the publication of the TU Dublin report. But QQI is also a qualifications authority and an awarding body of qualifications in our own right, particularly for further education and training in the private higher education sector. We also cherish our responsibility as the body responsible for the promotion, maintenance and further development of the Irish National Framework of Qualifications, which will be celebrating its 20th anniversary next year. As one of our key strategic priorities, we are committed to providing better information and opportunities for learners. We recognise that Qualifax, the national learners database that we host, already provides vital information on the opportunities for learners in the areas of further and higher education and apprenticeship, which are key to the development of a more unified tertiary education system. However, the Qualifications interface and presentation layout is outdated, and we are currently working on the development of a refreshed and more responsive website that will be of assistance, we hope, to learners in time for the start of the academic year beginning September 2023. We've also further developed the Irish Register of Qualifications, which contain all of the quality assured further and higher education qualifications included in the NFQ from all awarding bodies, universities, technological universities, institutes of technologies, and from all providers who offer QQI awards, such as the Education and Training Boards, community and voluntary sector providers, and private further education and training and higher education providers. Since our establishment, we've also developed key partnerships with the professional, statutory and regulatory bodies, the PSRBs. This was vitally important during the COVID-19 era, when the issue of student placements became a real challenge. More recently, we've seen the challenges posed for providers and learners due to the separate processes of academic validation by awarding bodies and programme accreditation by professional recognition bodies. QQI is committed to continue to work with the PSRBs on our principles for accreditation to ensure that these processes complement each other for the benefit of the learner and the protection of citizens. The area of protection for learners is key to other parts of QQI's strategy. Over the past year, we've been working on the infrastructure that is needed for the authorisation of an international education mark for higher education and English language education providers. This will require regulations to be in place for due diligence assessment of private providers offering such services, for the establishment of a statutory learner protection fund in the event that providers cease to provide programmes, and for the evaluation of providers' adherence to statutory codes of practice for the provision of higher education and English language education to international learners. We are well advanced on these developments and expect to be able to open an application window for an international education mark early in the new year. My colleague Jim Murray will brief the conference on these developments this afternoon. QQI's mission commits us to sustaining public confidence in the quality, integrity and reputation of Ireland's further and higher education providers and their qualifications. This confidence is threatened by the challenges to academic integrity posed by the insidious nature of international essay mills that seek to entice students into contract cheating through offering to write assignments that students later pass off as their own work. This is an international phenomenon that particularly threatens the Anglophone world. With the new functions assigned to QQI in 2019 related to contract cheating, we immediately set about establishing a National Academic Integrity Network, NAIN, which was led by and populated by representatives of all public and private higher education providers and by student representatives. We quickly recognised the global nature of these threats and have worked very closely since 2009 with colleagues from the UK, wider within Europe and also in Australia. This work will culminate in the launch this afternoon by the Minister for Further and Higher Education, Simon Harris, of a Global Academic Integrity Network, GAIN, and we're delighted to have many international colleagues from that network joining us and presenting at our conference today and tomorrow. Before we break for coffee, I would like to sincerely thank my colleagues in QQI who've worked so hard to make this event possible, in particular to the members of the partnership team, Karina Maguire, Laura Flynn, Alison Quinn, Sue Hackett, Gráinne Mooney, Mairead Boland, Duncan Keegan and Quiva Marshall, and to all the other colleagues from QQI. So to thank our speakers in particular this morning, I got the bus into work on the way and I did notice an advert looking to attract Irish people to work in the European institutions. You always learn something from Tony Conley. Thanks very much.